Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Hey, hello, and welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Today, I'm joined by Steve Steckler, a recognized expert in M&A integration, organizational change, and leadership effectiveness. Steve has led HR integration for billion-dollar deals, working with global organizations like Microsoft, Merck, and Marriott, and has contributed thought leadership through the conference board and HR forums worldwide. Steve, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here with you today.
Hey, thanks, Steve. So, Steve, jumping right in, you've had a front row seat to some of the biggest M&A deals that are out there. What initially drew you to focusing on the human side of M&A?
Well, one was more of a selfish point of interest in terms of having worked for a number of large companies and seeing how getting involved in M&A is really an accelerator, a career accelerator, because you're thrust into having to work with senior teams, and the usual route as an HR leader, it might take you years to get to know and to be intimate with an organization's strategy, their leadership. So it really was an accelerator in terms of development, and it really also was more inclusive of all the key things, and to really put experience and change and transformation and leadership effectiveness, have an opportunity to really practice that and also try some new things, because there still were areas, and I think there still are areas of M&A that are not as highly developed for a lot of organizations as other parts of running a business.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It does feel sometimes like things are, I don't know, not necessarily a little bit behind in the world of M&A, but they're ever changing. And I think it's almost harder to get right because every deal is a little bit different and you have to tweak little things as you go along.
I think that's really true. And one of the things we've tried to do in some of the forums and some of the sharing is make a list of things you never thought you'd encounter. So you don't forget that, because I think in M&A, there's a real risk of forgetting about or relearning the lessons you should have already learned and taken to heart.
Yeah, that's a good point. I often tell my teams that I don't expect to make no mistakes, but I want to make new mistakes.
That's a great way. And there are ways of avoiding too, avoiding making old mistakes.
Steve, I've heard you say, we've known each other for a few years, and I've heard you say the softer stuff is the hardest stuff to get right.
Yeah, and that's, I won't give myself credit or attribution. That's something Noel Tishy said. And, Noel headed up Jack Welch's Crotonville Leadership Development Center, which brought managers and executives to Crotonville, New York, and that was their real manufacturing facility for leadership and effectiveness. And it really is the hard stuff. I mean, and I've also felt that maybe it's because the easier stuff, like finance, or there are easier things regarding even HR, like pension plans and side-by-side analysis. The real harder stuff is the soft stuff, which is, how do you get organizations to work together? How do you get leadership teams to be trusting of each other? How do you really deal with those culture issues, which we know contribute to the majority of failures of achieving deal value?
Those are really, really great points. So when we think about deal value and we think about the soft stuff being the hard stuff or the hard part, how can companies avoid destroying deal value when they're tackling the culture parts?
Well, a couple things. I've thought about it, and due diligence is really reductive. I mean, it really reduces, and I think there's a real risk in failing to see the forest and failing to recognize the real organizational context you're facing. And I think part of that is for organizations and HR to really get better at figuring out what matters. For instance, when Microsoft purchased a small company in Paris, what was critical? I mean, should we make them drink Starbucks coffee? Because because on the campus, Microsoft has a contract with Starbucks, which probably can't compare to the coffee Parisianers, are used to and want to drink. So that's not critical. So I think part of it is what's critical to making the deal successful, to deal value, and how do you take a look at the larger picture without, basically asking questions about your culture versus our culture when it becomes reductive and you miss what really matters. So I think to be much more focused on the larger issues. For instance, how does sales and marketing work with R&D to serve the customer? Another example of that where we learned at Microsoft was, we had a sales team, they had a sales team. So we didn't need both sales teams. So we, of course, instead of doing a process in terms of perhaps picking from the best, we eliminated the acquired sales team. But then we found out within a year that sales and customer satisfaction were dropping because that company that we bought sold a different way to their customers. The salespeople collaborated with R&D and helped solve customer problems collectively. So you can miss that if you try and break down to how does sales work in terms of their objectives or their compensation versus ours, where you really need to focus more on the larger picture.
No, it's really fantastic advice. And I know a lot of organizations tend to do that. We're going to bring on these folks that we think are the key value drivers, but we really don't understand how these teams interact to drive value as a standalone organization. And that makes it sometimes difficult to think about how they're going to drive value as part of a combined organization.
And to your point, not just the organizations, but I've been in situations in large acquisitions where we thought this key executive was key to deal value, that person had created the online sales platform. So that is a keeper. That person was built into the metrics in terms of retention. And it turned out that that person wasn't responsible for creating the IP and getting the approval through the organization we acquired to have this online order processing system that was so unique. So you can bring in the wrong teams and think they're attributable to the success and the executives.
So thinking about the due diligence process, I love how you called it reductive, because I think you're right. Sometimes we want to reduce everything to a spreadsheet, right? And some things you simply can't put on a spreadsheet to sort out. So are there any hacks or tricks that you've had during the diligence process to help surface some of these people issues that come up?
I think, one of the things is, and this is, I think, an attribute for success, where whatever function or level of leadership you're involved is, you have to be inquisitive. You have to ask and probe. It's like in the mode of doing behavioral-based interviews. You can't accept the first response. You have to probe. You have to keep asking, and I think you have to keep that list in mind So, for instance, hard learned, when you're buying a company, have they had an acquisitive history? Have they integrate? Because you end up buying 5 companies, not one, because that company you're buying never integrated.
Right.
So how do so it's about being inquisitive. It's about asking questions. It's about kind of being reflective and saying, now what else might be interesting? Trusting your feelings, but also having that inquisitive nature and probing, and sometimes HR can do that and can be a pain in the neck, and can take it further. I mean, I remember one deal call where the project team was going through the updates, and this was a potential acquisition that German Merck was making in a country that was riddled with political conflict. Well, who's going to report out on the political function, so to speak, sales, finance, HR, production. But what about the political climate? What about what's going on in that country? Is this something we should really be looking at in terms of whether we should make this acquisition? And sometimes, everybody is just focused in their swim lanes and not willing to kind of make connections about, if we do this, then that might happen.
That's a great point. I know I worked on a deal several years ago in a country that was experiencing hyperinflation. And it was interesting. As I was going through and doing the diligence, I felt obligated to put together just a quick one-pager on what was happening to wages in that particular country, so we could do a 3 to 5 year projection for the ROI calculation. And nobody else had really thought about what was happening in that country. A strong man was coming in was not coming in. A strong man was reinforcing his position in that particular nation. And at some level in the back of my head, I was worried about assets being nationalized. And thankfully, I decided I just would address wage growth, and it led to a broader conversation. And while on paper it looked like a good deal, we ultimately passed because of those geopolitical concerns. So,
and that's a great example. Another example I can think of is when you're doing the side by side, and you're so hyper focused on salaries. You forget too that a smaller company's titles are not the same as yours. Level of specialization and focus and scope are very different as you go from different sizes. Another great example that thankfully somebody brought up that had a lot of production experience from HR said, it's not just a question of looking at payroll and trying to equalize or harmonize pay frequency. We've got to realize, for this company, those people needed their paychecks every week. They relied week to week. And by shifting them to twice monthly, which is what we did, what we had, would have been a disaster. And you need to, if you're still going to do it, you need to accommodate. So it's, again, looking at the full picture.
It's fantastic. Steve, when you and I have talked about change in the past, you do a really brilliant job of pointing to the fact that there are sort of rational reasons for the change, and then there are emotional factors to the change. When you're talking to leaders about preparing people for change, what are some practical steps that you share with those leaders as they're thinking about moving their workforce from where they are before the acquisition to where they'll be after the organization's combined?
Well, and, I go back to one thing that you have said too, which I think is really important, because as we talk about change, we talk about communication, we talk about messaging. And the worst thing in the world leadership of the acquirer can do is make this like, this is going to be the greatest thing that ever happened to you. And using a sales pitch and making it all about, you're joining us, we're great. because in traveling around the world at Microsoft, I really found that you're standing in front of people who, some of them can't wait. Maybe they can finally cash their paycheck because they're with a startup, versus others saying, I left a giant company to join a small company, and now I'm back where I started at a large company, whatever that means. So I think it's to really recognize that there are going to be a whole series of reactions to change. And there is going to be the rational side, which is perhaps career opportunity if that company, that larger company, is really integrated and has mobility and has systems and processes to move people around who want to be moved around. And the fact that you may be joining a more profitable organization, a company with more reputation, goodwill. But the emotional part is it can't be rushed. And just like people will react differently, it takes an amount of time for people to process that. And you look at how can you help them through that. And, we've done work where each manager and supervisor can actually help get people through change. If you look at some of David Rock's work, in terms of managing the emotional part of change, and to realize that, and this is something that I think also often is not realized, the deal team, the members of leadership may or may not like the fact that an acquisition is going forward, those that are part of the acquired company. But so by the time the managers and the supervisors and the employees get placed inside the tent, the team that has led this, the leadership team, the project team, the integration team, they've had time to get used to this. Mm-hmm. And that's a critical time lag where you got to let the managers, supervisors, and employees have the time to catch up and to process.
Oh, that's really fantastic advice. That folks who are under the tent, understand it.
Learned it the hard way in terms of, and actually we've done some work at Merck where we took a look at the emotional reactions, when you first heard, and now 3 months later as a member of the deal team or the integration team, how you feel. And the feelings will change. And that's what we need time to process. And there are ways that each manager and supervisor can actually help with this processing of their employees in reacting to the change. And of course, the other thing that I think is important for HR to focus on is auditing communications. How bombarded are people becoming? How much communications? Are they the right communications? Is the level of honesty and compassion attached to each sufficiently to each communication?
Well, there's so much there. I would love to dive for a moment, Steve, into your thoughts about how we can prepare people leaders, to guide their teams through the change. You mentioned that earlier, and I would love to get some of your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, and part of this, I think, can go back to actually the deal team and the integration team. One of the opportunities HR has is how do you help those teams become high-performing teams where depending on the group and how many people are full-time dedicated M&A folks versus this is their night job, their new day job, they have another day job. We've all been through that. And so the players sometimes change. They often change. So it's a new team. How can HR accelerate the effectiveness, the trust level, the working relationship of a deal team, of an integration team? How can they get people to share at the end of the day what we found in our due diligence although it's finance, it may also play a role in production or sales or just dealing with customers, or it may even give a clue to the culture that might be missed. So I think there's that opportunity in terms of of acquiring teams and blended leadership teams, I think it's often powerful to get people at the leadership level to talk about the values and look at the values of each company, the acquirer and the acquired, and hopefully there's some synergy, there's some, intersection. But even if there's not, get leaders to talk about what means something to them, about how do you do business, how do you lead, how do you interact with managers and employees, where are customers in this mix, and to get them to talk. And by talking about values, if you have 7 or 8 or 6, we did that at Merck, and it was very powerful. We videotaped the blended leadership team. And by the way, if we had done this before we decided who to blend, that also might have created even a better team in terms of, what values are really consistent, whether they're stated or not. But anyway, we did that, and to get them to talk about what values are important to them. And we showed that during orientation onboarding, so it had a double impact. So I think that starts getting at trust. I think that you can, HR or outside consultants can also gauge the effectiveness. To what degree is each team an effective team? And is the acquirer just going to transfer the dysfunction to any members that join them from the acquisition? So I think it's an opportunity, but there's also limited time. So in other words, if your acquiring leadership team is dysfunctional, is not a high performing team, by blending other members of it, or by asking them to manage a new entity through the acquisition, I think that's going to be an uphill battle.
I know one of the things that you're really known for, Steve, is your ability to help create these high-performing teams. And you mentioned a few moments ago trust. And I'm curious about, number one, how you see the role of trust in creating this high-performing blended team, and other ideas that you might have for building trust between both sides of a deal, especially after what can be just knockdown, drag-out negotiations on the final agreement, or even the feelings of broken trust I know that sometimes come up during a contentious due diligence process.
Yeah. I think some model is helpful, in terms of William Bridges' model of transition. I think to look at it, we all talk about deal stages, from, the search for an acquisition, the pre-due diligence, the signing, the due diligence, the through the different stages, all the way through. Finally, integration is over, and we're an up and running entity. I think we can look at these stages and look at what are the challenges for leaders at each of these stages, and I think it's some hard work. It's really getting the right people in a room, and having perhaps an outside third party give them feedback. It's executive coaching. It's also getting back to deal value, getting back to what are the behaviors we need to demonstrate in order to be successfully perceived as a team, and to get our employees, our managers, supervisors, and employees on board. And I think that sometimes, we think that having, a closing party and having alcohol, is going to increase trust, and it really doesn't. I mean, I think we've all been at enough offsites. There's got to be some hard work. I think if you can take the team through and say, here are the stages we're going through, and here are what are the key success factors, and here are what are the stumbling blocks or the risks at each of these stages, and not being honest, not being truthful, hiding the truth, not explaining the rationale for decisions. I think those are all part of what we can play with, we can introduce to try and increase the trust.
Fantastic advice. So if we think about expanding that trust from the leadership team and rolling it down through the combined organization, are there some things that you would do differently when dealing with, say, individual contributors or middle managers than you do with the leadership team to build trust in both the process and candidly in the buyer, who often is not trusted?
Yes, and that's why your track record and your reputation, and it's easier now. I mean, people know more about the company they're joining as an organic hire than they ever did. Whether it's Glassdoor, whether it's social media, whether and I think the acquired employees are going to know a lot about you, whether it's truthful or not, from social media, and that's another issue. Do we believe them? And what are their sources? But I think we have to look at, and again, it comes down to, let's not oversell this. Let's not say this is going to be great for everyone. What I go back to is what Welch used to say at Crotonville. Evidently, he used to say, "This is how we operate. This is our company. This is what we care about. If you don't like that, if that isn't consistent with your belief system, we'll help you get a job somewhere else." It's that kind of attitude to say, we recognize you're all going to have different reactions depending on a variety of things. How change has been handled, if you were part of an acquisition in the past, how that was handled, what kind of leadership and management you've had. And I think you have a very small window for suspension of disbelief, where you can say, okay, we understand you have a history. This is us. This is who we are. And there has to be continued out front messaging and behavior, in terms of walking the halls and really practicing what you preach in terms of to the acquired employees. And I think it goes back to also individual contributors, as you mentioned. What is it that, and having a little experience with motivation theory, not the same thing motivates everyone, and to be smart about that, and to be broad-based enough to say, I think our total value proposition for each employee, for each supervisor and manager is robust enough. And the differences are going to be made clear. And what we're not going to do and what we say about what we're not going to do is very important earlier rather than later. Everybody gets a bonus at this particular company that we know that. We are not going to do that. That is not consistent with our compensation strategy. So what are the areas that we are not going to harmonize? That's important. I think that builds trust. I think that also helps deal with individual contributors, scientists, people that are in different career ladders, to basically say, what are the non-negotiables?
Fantastic insight, Steve. So we're almost out of time here today, but I would love to hear from you. If you could give one piece of advice to HR folks that are leading their way through their first M&A, what would that piece of advice be?
Well, I think you're in a position, even if you're not a dedicated M&A or HR M&A person, you are in a unique position. It is a career multiplier. You are going to be having to quickly understand strategy, product roadmaps, leadership teams, figure out, from whatever process you've been involved with and whatever sharing takes place. So I think that it's to ask questions. This is the worst place to, I guess the expression is impersonate, the imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Don't ever worry about that. Ask questions. Try things on to say, one of the famous expressions, I may be making this up or I'm trying to figure this out on the go, but look at the leadership team, look at the integration team, look at whether you have a mentor, external, internal. There are no dumb questions. This is new, and this is very different in terms of your typical HR career up to now. So I think realizing that and preparing yourself, reading books, going to conferences, sharing, finding people and forums where, and we've done this, and some of the forums that you've been involved with and instituted are really opportunities to say, I wouldn't want to say this in front of my boss, but let me tell you what I learned and some of the mistakes I made.
Fantastic advice as always, Steve. So where can folks find you, Steve, if they're looking for your words of wisdom around M&A?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, and I also am at a point in my career where I think it's not all about, the time clock and billable hours, so to speak. So you can get in touch with me via my email. I have a website that's also posted. And I'd love to help and talk. And it's hard-earned advice. And again, it's all about accelerating knowledge, experience, and success. So thanks for asking that question. And it's a great opportunity. There's nothing like it in the world of HR, because you have to become competent and capable in so many things and have backbone, because, that moment during an integration meeting, during a call, working with the leadership team, assessing the acquired leadership team, those are opportunities, and you've got to be prepared to take them.
That's great advice on using this M&A experience as a career accelerator. Really fantastic. So, Steve, thank you so much. For folks that are out there navigating your own M&A journey, be sure to check Steve's work out. We'll put some links in the show notes. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please remember to subscribe and share. Steve, thank you so much.
Welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Klint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.